And let's go to Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And again, in the manifestations, we're reminded about how we're to have peace. And in Mina's manifestation, remember what I made you to be, you can be confident. And I think that's a lot of the heart of where I'm going. It may not cover all the stuff that I'm covering tonight, but that's a lot of it, that you and I as Christians want to be peaceful, confident people. And it's amazing how many Christians are not confident, they're not peaceful, and they're guilt-ridden. And we don't need to be that way. And so many times, it, it's kind of funny because sometimes our Christianity works against us. You talk to pagans and they're not guilt-ridden. They're the center of their universe, and they're going to do what they want to do, and they're going to spend their money where they want to spend it, and they're going to go where they want to go, and they're not guilty about anything. They're just the center of their universe. And then you get to be a Christian, and you're supposed to put others first, and you're supposed to pray for people, and you're supposed to read the Bible, and you're supposed to witness, and you're supposed to give financially to Christian organizations and needy people and that kind of thing. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I don't spend enough time praying. I do that. I that one, I keep having to remind myself about prayer because I tend to be in the book and then not in prayer. But people are, I'm not spending enough time praying. I'm not spending enough time witnessing. I should be spending more of my time with, the sick or the poor or the elderly or people in hospitals or whatever it is. And or people have friends that call up, well, can you do this? Can you do this? And the next thing you know, they're overcommitted. And then they feel badly about being overcommitted. But then if they don't overcommit, they feel badly about not being committed enough. And then if they take a break and try to take a rest, then they feel badly about taking a rest. And it's really a kind of a catch-22. And so we need to break through that. So Ecclesiastes 2 and 3 have some stuff that we can grab onto. So Ecclesiastes, starting at the end of chapter 1 and chapter 2, lists a whole bunch of things that the person's the author, who I think is the author's God, the writer's probably Solomon, and he's writing about all the things that he did to find out what was good to do in life. And of course, then he's upset because no matter what he does, no matter what he accomplishes, he's going to die, and he's going to give that to people who don't appreciate him or his work or the work itself. And so verse 18 of Ecclesiastes 2 says, verse 17 rather says, so I hated life. Because if you're a natural person, if you have no hope in everlasting life, and you realize that you can work and work and work and work to accomplish things, and then you die, and like they say, you can't take it with you. So eventually you hate life. Verse 17 of chapter 2, and then chapter 2, 18, and I hated all my labor. Yeah, hate your labor. And then verse 22, we get where we could be if we didn't know about everlasting life. Verse 22, for what does a person get from all his labor and from the stress of his heart that he labors at under the sun? Verse 23, for all his days are pain and his business is frustrating. Business there are the things he is busy with. You could translate this, for all his days are pain and the things he's busy with are frustrating. Yes, even at night, his heart does not rest. This also is pointless. And it is pointless if there's no God, and it is pointless if there's no everlasting life for you, because you have this one life, it's painful and it's frustrating, and you live it, and then you die, and because you haven't accepted Christ or obeyed God, then you die and you're thrown in the lake of fire and you're burned up, and that's the end. And it seems pointless, and sure enough, it would be. And so verse 24 starts a breakthrough in the writer of Ecclesiastes. And it should start a breakthrough for us in our thinking. Verse 24, there is nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink. And eat and drink is the technical figure of speech is called polar merismos. It's where you have two things that kind of cover everything in the middle. So, for example, my friend John Crouch used to say, he'd explain something and he'd say, well, that's the long and the short of it. In other words, that's the whole thing. Or something you see in some of the verses of scripture in the Bible where it talks about a person and it says, you know, they go out and they come in. They go out of their tent in the morning, they come in at night. It means they live their whole life. So here it's like, well, what's better for a person than he should eat and drink, meaning live your life and make his soul enjoy good in his labor. And that we all have the same thing, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's our time frame. We can't buy any more time, or add to it or subtract from it. That's the time that we have. And so what we want to do is we want to become good at enjoying life and enjoying what we're doing. Now, there's a whole lot of life. Franklin Smith's mother, Annabelle Smith, used to say, life is so daily, because it's really true. It seems like every day you take off dirty clothes, you put on clean clothes, you take a shower, you clean up, you eat breakfast, then you eat lunch, then you eat dinner. I mean, there's so much of life that's just simply daily. And so we've got to figure out ways to make that enjoyable. We've got to figure out ways to make it profitable. Now, if you're doing what you're doing that in a way that in your mind and in the scope of your life, you've organized your life so that you know what you're doing is a blessing to God, then you know that you're earning rewards for your labor. You may, in the eternal rewards for your labor, you may have heard of the Christian work ethic. And that was a really important, if I'm not mistaken, and some historian may correct me, but if I'm not mistaken, it was John Wesley who really drove the Christian work ethic into what we call modern Protestant theology. Because as you're coming through the Middle Ages, and especially with the Roman Catholic Church, basically work wasn't, the idea of eternal rewards, forget that. That wasn't part of it. You either went to heaven or you went to hell. So there was no rewards, no concept of rewards in the afterlife. And as a result, the people that got merit were the priests. So you had the priestly class and you had everybody else. And there was no, if you were a good Catholic and you went to church and you did confession and that kind of thing, then you got to heaven, and hey, that's the goal. And if you were just a laborer, you were a farmhand, you were a miner, you were a woodsman, whatever you were, it was like, yeah, that wasn't particularly valuable. What was valuable was going to church, doing confession, giving to the church, that kind of thing. John Wesley comes along, and to my understanding, he was the person who said, no, if you're working your work, whatever it is, from the farmhand to the woodsman to the herdsman, whatever your work is, there's value in it, and God sees that, and God will reward you for it. And that was the genesis of the Protestant work ethic, and one of the reasons that the Western world then leapt ahead of the rest of the world in inventions and discoveries, and why we built the big cities, why we discovered new lands, all that stuff was because all of a sudden somebody was teaching, and by that time it had spread to all kinds of ministers of different denominations. But ministers were teaching that if you will do what you do heartily as for the Lord, you're going to get a reward for it. And you and I today, we look at that and we go, of course. But if you lived around 1200 AD, you never heard that. I mean, that was not on anybody's radar scope. And the Protestant work ethic changed modern Christianity. And I believe it was John Wesley who really inculcated that into the teaching. And so here it sits, there's nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink. In other words, live and make his soul enjoy good in his labor. And that's what we want to do. So if we're working heartily as to the Lord and we're enjoying what we do, That's going to be a lot of what will be a blessing to our life. If you get up every day and you hate what you do and you hate your life, life becomes difficult. Even if you are going to live forever, life is still difficult. So we need to make decisions that help us see the value in what we're doing. And sometimes that means taking risks, that kind of thing, where we want to take risks in what we do. That's really important. So then it says, enjoy good in his labor. This I saw that it is from the hand of God. And all of a sudden, here's God introduced into Ecclesiastes. And then verse 25, for who can eat or who can have enjoyment apart from him? And that's really true. One of the reasons we can enjoy life and not be depressed about life, particularly as you get older, and I've watched as I've gotten older, and I'm now in my 70s, and my teenage grandson is much stronger than me and faster than me, and he plays soccer and he runs up and down the field, and I watch him and I go, I used to be able to do that, but I can't do it now. And you watch things kind of shift. And if I didn't believe in everlasting life and I was going to get a brand new body like Christ's glorious body, I'd be all depressed. It's like rats. You work all your life and all that happens is you get old and things fall apart. How can you not be depressed at that? But if you look forward to an everlasting life and a brand new body, then you can be all excited because I'm one day closer to my brand new body than I was yesterday, one way or the other. If the Lord comes back, yes. If the Lord doesn't come back, yes. So that's, so you can get excited about that stuff. So he says, to make your soul enjoy good in your labor, this I saw that's from the hand of God. For who can eat or who can have enjoyment apart from him, apart from God? And then verse 26, for the one who pleases him, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. Now, this is one of the places where we see teamwork, because if you sit around and never read anything, never watch any educational TV, never engage in any intellectual discussions, you can live your life and not gain any wisdom or knowledge. Um, so when it says God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy, it's a help situation. We read books, we watch educational TV, we watch videos. I watch how-to fishing videos fairly regularly on YouTube. Not that I didn't get skunked last Saturday, but I did. But anyway, best fishing trips in the world sometimes don't work. But anyway, God gives you the wisdom and the knowledge as we work at it. But then I love the last one, joy, because there's joy in life, and that's something that sets Christians apart. And one of the skills that Christians need to master is being joyful in tough situations, because that is difficult and it doesn't come naturally, and it takes practice, and it takes focusing on the hope, and it takes kind of letting go of things of this life and that type of thing. But I love the fact that when it talks about what God gives, he does give knowledge, yes. He does give wisdom, yes, but he gives joy. And I love that. And that's one of the things that should be so attractive to non-Christians, is that people can have joy. And then verse 26 goes on, but to the sinner, he gives the business of gathering and collecting only to give to the one who pleases God. And this is an interesting statement because it's almost it's got two sides to it. One side is what we call the ideal statement. In other words, if the world was run by Jesus Christ, if the situations on earth were ideal, then it would work that somehow or other the wealth that sinners worked for would end up in the hands of the righteous. Now, that still happens to a certain degree, but because the devil is the God of the world, he manipulates things and works things such that not all the wealth of the wicked goes to the godly, even though that's a general principle. By the way, this isn't the only place this is stated. take a quick look at Proverbs 13, verse 22. Proverbs 13:22. This is another really, really wonderful proverb. Proverbs 13:22 says, "A good person will provide an inheritance for his children's children." Now, while we're reading that, it doesn't mean that if you're a good person, so you don't give your kids anything, you give your grandkids stuff. That's not what the verse is saying. What the verse is saying is if you're a good person, you're a wise person, you handle your money and your resources wisely, you're going to leave enough that your kids are helped and your grandkids are helped. And that's really true. And I know a number of people, of my age and friends have passed away, and in their wills they had worked in their life and set things up to make sure that their family got some benefit from all their years of labor. And that's a really good thing to do. And by the way, you don't want to leave your family in a mess. It's always a good idea to have a will, so that people don't fight, and so that the courts don't take any of the what you'd like to pass on to your family or friends or whatever. But anyway, it starts out, a good person will provide an inheritance for his children's children, but, and here's the parallel to Ecclesiastes, the wealth of the sinner is being stored up for the righteous person. So again, that's an ideal proverb, that in an ideal world, the wealth of sinners would transfer in this life to the righteous. As it is, there's lots and lots of sinners who either squander all their money or their resources, and it ends up in the hands of the righteous, or they end up in jail, or they end up dying prematurely, or in some way the righteous person ends up what they worked for. But then both Proverbs 13:22 and Ecclesiastes, we can go back to Ecclesiastes, both Proverbs 13:22 and Ecclesiastes 2:26 have an eschatological viewpoint as well. That why does the wealth of the sinner end up going to the righteous? Because the righteous are going to live forever and inherit the earth, and the sinners are going to be annihilated in the lake of fire, so they won't have anything. So that is factored into the interpretation of these verses. And so it's very important that when we're reading 226 that we disconnect the two sentences, because God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy, period. But to the sinner, he gives the business of gathering and collecting only to give to the one who pleases God. This too is pointless and hurting the wind. The fact that the sinner can live his whole life, work his whole life, and just end up giving everything to someone else, it's pointless for him. And this is one of the things that in our empathy for other people and our love for other people, this is the kind of thing that motivates us to witness. We don't want to see people thrown in the lake of fire. We don't want to see people just die and their whole life was a waste, and that they're barely a memory, because once you're destroyed in the lake of fire, the rest of life moves on with all of us saved people. So this kind of thing is motivational. But to connect chapter 2, what we've just read, to chapter 3, we're talking about, in context of verse 24, there's nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and make his soul enjoy good in his labor. That's going to involve decisions. And that's where chapter 3 is going to start. By the way, this idea about eating, drinking, enjoying good in your labor is a very, very prominent theme through Ecclesiastes. We see it here in 224. We see it in 3:4, 3:12 and 13, 3:22, chapter 5, verse 18 and 19, chapter 8, verse 15, chapter 9, verses 7 to 9, and 10:19, and chapter 11, verses 7 to 8. And all this is in the commentary on Ecclesiastes. So you don't have to scribble those verses down. They're already written for you in the commentary. Let's go to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, it says, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. And this then kind of sets a tone for life. For everything, there's a season. There's times and seasons to do things. And when it says season and a time, sometimes you'll run into translations that will use the term appointed time. For everything, there's an appointed time. That's true if you understand it. Because what some people do is they say, well, God's in control, and in fact, I just read a commentary on Ecclesiastes today that God's in control and all these appointed times are set by God. And that's not true. There are appointed times because you've got to appoint a time. You've got to make things happen. Now, there are things that God works in, no question about that. And we have to work with that. Like when it comes to the planting season and the growing season, we have to find out what God's timetable is for that. But we still have to decide to plant or not plant based on the weather, the temperature, and that kind of thing. So for everything, there's a season, a time for every matter under heaven. And that's something that we want to consider. That's kind of overarching. If we're going to enjoy good in our life, we're going to have to make decisions. And we can't feel guilty about those decisions. And by the way, not making a decision is a decision. And people make that mistake all the time. They don't want to rise to the occasion and make a decision, but if they don't make a decision, that decision is made for them. And I think that's important. And again, we heard in the manifestations tonight about being confident in ourselves, and we need to. So verse 2 starts out with the overarching beginning and end of life, because everything that's going to happen to us happens between birth and death. So it starts out by saying, okay, there's a time to be born and a time to die. So these things are going to be happening. Now, the time to be born, again, parents help to set that time by what they do sexually and stuff like that. But for any individual, you've got a time in which you were born and a time to die. That's your overarching life. And now all the rest of your decisions need to be made within that. Then it says a time to plant and a time to uproot what was planted. Now, we know that the ancient world and Old Testament Israel was very agricultural. So what you're going to have here is you're going to have some literal and some metaphorical. In other words, there's going to be a literal meaning and there'll be a metaphorical application. And that's something that we need to pay attention to. So when it says a time to plant and a time to uproot what was planted, you and I know if you live in an agricultural society, there is a time to plant, and that's our cooperation with God, because we can't set the seasons. God sets the seasons in place, and there are specific times when it's good to plant, times when it's not good to plant, and times when what we've planted has produced and died, and now it's time to pull that up and move on and prepare the soil. And so one of the things that verse 2, the part B, the latter part is pointing out is get in tune with the Lord's timing. And sometimes we talk about that, that the Lord has timing for different things. Get in tune with the Lord's timing, because the Lord has things that he wants to do, things that he wants to accomplish. He certainly did that with Israel in the Old Testament. He's still doing that. So one of the things this is encouraging us to do is to get in touch with the Lord's timing of what he wants. And then it says there's a time to plant and a time to uproot. And those are decisions, because metaphorically, planting refers to, building anything, wanting to produce anything. We start with ideas and then we move forward. And there's a time when we move forward with new ideas in our life. And then there's a time when it becomes pretty obvious that it was an unprofitable idea. Things didn't work out. And you guys have probably all heard of like businessmen and women who have an idea and they start to follow it, and all of a sudden it needs money and it needs more money and it needs more money and it needs more time. And the next thing you know, they get sucked into this kind of vortex that takes their time and money, and they don't pull the plug fast enough. And if you, Dan Gallagher was a tremendous businessman, and his father ran a lumber yard, and his father was a tremendous businessman, and he always used to say, "Be slow to hire, quick to fire." You take your time to make sure you've got good employees, but if somebody is a bad apple, if they're hurting your organization, you want to be quick to fire. And so what's hard here? It's a time to plant. Yeah, you want to plan and do the best you can, but there's a time to uproot. And that takes a decision that can be difficult to make, but it's important to say, okay, it's over, it's done. We're going to stop putting money and time into this. Then verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal. Now this becomes important because again, we run into people's guilt. I mean, a time to kill. Let's go to Exodus chapter 21. The Christian world, for the most part, is very, I don't necessarily want to use the word dishonest, but honestly, I think that's basically what it is. You know, because the Bible is very clear in the Old Testament. There are certain people, and remember, people have free will. And there are certain people that the Bible says these people need to be put to death. They need to be removed from the society so the society can be safe. That would be murderers, kidnappers, that kind of person. The Bible says should be killed. If you own a dangerous animal and you know your animal is dangerous, if you just read Exodus 21 and 22, the example that gives in Exodus 21 and 22 is the example of a man who owns an ox, and the ox is going around goring people, and the owner won't do anything about it. And then the ox gores somebody to death. And what does the Bible say to do? You kill the ox and the owner. You're not allowed to terrorize society with the stuff that you own. These kind of rules become very important. So, verse 12. Anyone who strikes a person so that he dies must be put to death. Yes, death. The word death occurs twice in the Hebrew text for emphasis, and that's very important. And then if you read the commentary on Exodus 21:12, I have a huge commentary on the death penalty and the number of places it's mentioned and the people who used it, like Moses put people to death, David put people to death. Godly men, Samuel put people to death. Godly men through the Old Testament used the death penalty to keep society safe. And so here's Ecclesiastes, and it says there's a time to kill, and it's again, there's so much hesitation and guilt, and I know that you don't ever execute anybody or anything without a lot of thought and prayer. But the bottom line is eventually it comes to the fact that there's a time to kill. And that can also, by the way, mercy killing in the sense of like, we had owned a dog that we dearly loved, but after, she got to be old and she was in pain with every step and stuff, we took her to a vet. The vet recommended that we put her to sleep, and we did. And, you guys know about putting an animal to sleep. It's very painless. And of course, the only pain felt was from Genevieve and me. We were in pain for a very long time. But there's a time to kill, and you can't let the adversary get you filled with guilt over that. No matter whether it's executing an evil person or executing putting to sleep an animal, that it's time for them to go to sleep because of the miserable condition of their life. And so the Bible says there's a time to kill. It's good for it to say that because there are people that don't believe it. But then you ruin society trying to keep people alive that shouldn't be kept alive. And then it says a time to heal. And this is really important too. Obviously, there's a time to heal diseases and stuff like that. Go to a doctor. I think for me, as I have read this verse over the years, that the time that when I talk about time to heal for me, it's usually emotional scarring. It's usually mental, emotional stuff because you go through the death of a loved one, or you go through the breakup of a friendship, or you go through a betrayal, or something like that, and there's a huge emotional deficit, and there's pain and hurt, and every person processes that differently. It's interesting that if you note, you will not at any place in the Bible, and this is something I've checked several times, but there's no place where it says, and a person gets to heal for whatever, 50 days, 70 days, 1 year, 2 years, 20 days. There's no time limit ever given on what it takes to heal because everybody's different. But if you need time to heal, and see, we live in a hectic rush, get it done yesterday world. And you go through a very emotional time and you need some time to yourself and you need some time to heal. And you've got neighbors and business partners and this and that. Come on, get over it. Come on, we need you back to work. We need this, we need that. And and they don't get it. The Bible says there's a time to heal, and we need to be honest, about because some people, can't put the emotional brakes on, and they need some coaching in that area. But more often than not, it's exactly the opposite. That people are being pestered to get back to work, get up on your feet way long before they're ready. And that's emotionally difficult. If you take a quick look at Romans chapter 12, and this verse was pointed out to me by a friend of mine who lost a son to sudden death syndrome. But if you look at Romans chapter 12, verse 15, in verse 15 it says, "Rejoice with those who are rejoicing, cry with those who are crying." That's our job. That's empathy. That's being there for people. That's supporting people. It doesn't say cry with people who are crying for 30 days, or whatever. So you see God's heart on this. God knows that everybody's different. Some people can move on very quickly. Some people can break through emotional ties very quickly. Some people take a very long time. The Bible never puts a time frame on how long it takes you to heal. That's between you and the Lord. And like I say, can that be abused for some people? Yes, it can, but it's usually the opposite. It's usually that people are pestered out of the time they need to heal. So I love the fact that Ecclesiastes 3:3 says there's a time to heal. And and we need to take that time. That's super important. By the way, that was part of the Sabbath, was just to give people a chance to rest, recoup, find out who they were. If we go to Deuteronomy chapter 5 real quick, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, the 10 Commandments are in Exodus 20, and that was at the very first year of the wilderness wanderings. And then they're repeated in Deuteronomy 5, which was the last year of the wilderness wanderings. And so God had kind of bracketed the 40 years in the wilderness with the 10 Commandments, telling the people, this is how I want you to be. Here are the 10 major laws that are going to structure your society. And then at the end of the 40 years, because remember, everybody over 20 years old who came out of Egypt died off in the wilderness, except Joshua and Caleb, and I think the Levites as well. And then by Deuteronomy 5, then you're talking to a whole nother generation. Let's reframe the 10 Commandments. Let's make sure everybody understands them. Listen to the detail in the Sabbath. Deuteronomy 5, verse 12, observe the Sabbath day. And the word Sabbath just means rest. It's kind of funny because we could translate this R with a rest with a capital R. Observe the rest day to keep it as holy. We lose something in translation when we don't know what the Hebrew word means, because the word Sabbath means rest. So God says, observe the rest day to keep it holy, which keep it holy, holy in this context just means set apart. You set apart the rest day, and you know what you do on it? You rest. And we have a society that doesn't like to rest. And no sooner do we have a day off than we find something to do. And God says, can you just like chill and rest? And look at the emphasis he puts on this. He says, observe the rest day to keep it holy, as Yahweh your God commanded you. You are to work 6 days and do all your work. You're not supposed to let it leak over into the seventh day. Verse 14, but the seventh day is a rest to Yahweh your God, in which you must not do any work. So I like how he says you must rest, and then he says don't do any work. And he has to double it up, or they'd figure out a way to work on it. And then he says, who doesn't have to work? Not you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your livestock, nor any. That means you can't make your ox or donkey carry stuff. You can't load up their back and make them carry stuff, nor your stranger who's inside your gates, so that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. Now, there's an interesting omission here in Deuteronomy chapter 5 that's also omitted in Exodus chapter 20, and that is moms. Because, moms had babies, and you can't just set your baby down on the morning of the Sabbath and walk away and say, I'll see you in 24 hours. That's not going to work. Babies need a lot of care. They need to be carried around. They need to be cleaned up. They need to be fed. There's a whole bunch of care that babies need. And so it's interesting that it's conspicuously absent from any statement about the Sabbath, including the initial statement and the final Sabbath, Deuteronomy 20 and Exodus, Deuteronomy 5 and Deuteronomy in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. And in this whole list of all the people that aren't supposed to work, and moms are left out. And then verse 15, you are to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, Yahweh your God commanded you to keep the rest day. And so there we are. And of course, we don't have to keep the Sabbath today. It's not a law for the Christian church, but it's a fantastically good idea. People need to rest. So even though it's not a law, it's a really great idea to take a rest. So anyway, let's go back to Ecclesiastes. So we're in the time to heal, verse 3. Then the latter part of the verse 3, Ecclesiastes 3:3, a time to tear down and a time to build up. And the two primary ways that this vocabulary is used in the Bible is in construction and in war. However, the words tear down and build up are used in a bunch of other ways as well. So basically, this is telling us, look, there's a time when you're done with whatever it is you're doing, and it's not profitable and it's no longer a blessing, and you tear it down. And there's a time to find something that maybe it's dilapidated, maybe it's in disrepair, maybe it's not there and you need it, like a wall or a building or whatever. And so you build things up, and there's a time to, and again, behind the time is a decision. And that's the decision you've got to feel good about. Okay, it's time to spend some money and time and tear this thing down. It's the right time to spend some time and money and build this thing up. And those are decisions that we have to make. And then verse 4, and I love verse 4 because the whole verse ties together in a way that no other two juxtaposed things fit together. So it starts out in verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. And obviously, we can see the similarity, the comparison, if you will, between weeping and mourning, and laughing and dancing. And the thing that really pops out to me when I read verse 4, and with I've been in ministry now for over half a century, and I've talked to a lot of people that have lost loved ones, some of them expected, people that passed away in their old age, but many of them unexpectedly, people that were killed in one way or another, killed in Vietnam, killed in a car wreck, killed by a drug overdose, and one of the things I've dealt with people is they're they're internally conflicted and feel guilty because they'll be really sad, but then they'll have memories of things, fun things they did together, and they begin to laugh and have a good time and remember the good times. And so when you're in a deep grief situation, not only is the grief in like a sine wave where you have periods of high grief and periods of low grief, but intermixed with that are times when you'll just burst out spontaneously laughing, and feel like dancing because you just had such good times and you had such good memories. And I've talked to people that are just horrendously guilty about that. But this person is dead. How can I be laughing about them? How can I be feeling so jovial? And of course, it doesn't last very long, but they don't know where it comes from. And if you read the Old Testament and just pay attention to God's emotions, it says in the Psalm that God laughs at certain things. Then God's mad at certain things. Then God's vengeful. Then God, and then God says, my name is jealous. It does. It says, my name is jealous. And then he's a jealous God. And you have this God whose emotions are all over the map. And then you've got Genesis 1 that says he created us in his image. So what should we expect of our emotions? Well, we should expect them to be all over the map. And for normal human beings, they are. We have this huge range of emotions we go through in life. And it's an interesting tightrope that we want to be able to express our emotions because they're who God made us to be, and yet control them so that because the expression of emotion can be disastrous, destructive, hurtful, that kind of thing. So there's a way to express emotions in a godly way. But here, a time to weep and sorrow and that kind of thing comes in waves. And then there's other times to weep, like you may have invested a lot of time in a project or a friendship or something else, and it falls apart and you're just kind of heartbroken over it. So there's all kinds of different reasons to weep. But the beauty of it, here's Ecclesiastes acknowledging that and saying, hey, don't feel guilty about weeping. There's a time to weep. Don't feel guilty about laughing. There's a time to laugh. And something I've just experienced recently was there was something happened and some people were laughing and some people weren't. And the people that weren't laughing got mad at the people that were laughing and saying, how can you laugh at that? And it just popped out at me like, wow, different people process input, data input, sensory input differently. And to some people, an event is funny, and to some people, an event is sorrowful or heavy or whatever you want to call it. And we, everybody lives in their own mind. And we let people process emotion the way they need to process emotion. Now, yes, are there psychologically unbalanced people out there? Yes, there are. And we're not talking about the fringes and the extremes. We're talking about the center of the bell curve. And there are people that are just different, and we've got to be aware of that. And so there is a time to weep, and there's a time to laugh, and there's a time to mourn, and then there's a time to build up. And these are important. A time to weep and laugh, and a time to mourn and to dance. Then verse 5, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. And at first, especially to our Western mind, These are completely separate. You're casting or gathering stones, and you're embracing or refraining from embracing. And they can be very separate, but they can also be interconnected, and I'll explain that. First of all, the most obvious thing, a time to cast away stones in the biblical culture, which was agricultural, what was the most common time that anybody cast away stones was when they were farming, especially if they were breaking in a new field and it had a bunch of rocks. And if you're going to, get a good crop and, harvest well and all that, then you want to get those rocks out of there. So you want to cast those stones away. And there's plenty of land in Israel that you can't grow a crop on that you can throw stones away on. And then a time to gather stones together. Again, you would gather together stones for a wall that you would be building, say in a terraced garden, or you would gather stones to build a marker for where your field ends and the next guy's field begins. Those type of things you gather stones for. But another thing that you gather stones for in the biblical world was you gathered stones for memorials, and you gathered stones to memorialize covenants. And so, for example, when Jacob and Laban made a covenant that they wouldn't trespass on the other's property, Genesis says that Laban, this is Genesis 31, verses 51 and 52, that Laban made a heap of stones. And it's a heap of stones that's a witness of the covenant they made. And so as you made a memorial that was maybe a covenant, then that would also tie into embracing or refraining from embracing. So for example, if Jacob and Laban are piling up stones to be a witness that they don't like each other and they're not going to trespass on each other's property, that's a time to refrain from embracing. You don't want to build a memorial that says we don't like each other and then embrace. So they can be interconnected. On the other side of the coin is if you and your next door neighbor farmer agree that this is where your boundary marker is, then you gather stones and you build a boundary marker. Then in our world, we'd shake on it. And in the biblical world, they'd embrace on it and say, okay, this is the boundary marker. And so they're actually tied together. But then when they're not tied together, you're building a wall and that kind of thing, or you're clearing a field. And then there's a time to embrace when you're making friendships, when people need support, when you need support, that kind of thing. And then there's a time to refrain from embracing. That becomes the more difficult one, because people that you're upset with somebody, they've hurt your feelings, this and that and the other thing, it may not be the time for embracing. You may say, you know what? I don't want to get that close right now. I don't want to become that intimate until we have a chance to talk and iron this out. And that's a good thing. But then I've talked to people, well, I felt so guilty, because it's like, no, it was a time to refrain from embracing. And to know that that's there is important. There is a time to say no. This is not the proper time to give hugs and kisses. This is a time to work things out. Then we can move forward to hugs and kisses if we're on the same page. And that's important. And again, so what this verse does, it gives you permission to refrain from embracing. Verse 6, very important, again, a time to search and a time to count it as lost. The time to search is usually easy to come by. You've lost something important, and it's time to search. This morning when I got up, I couldn't find my wallet to save my life. I'm like, I can't lose my wallet. My God, you just can't lose your wallet. I had no idea where it was, so it was a time to search, and I searched and the last thing I of course, no wonder it's the last thing I searched because I found it. But it just was popped into my head that, well, I took my wallet fishing. I wonder if I left it in my fishing tackle. And sure enough, I had. So it was a time to search, and then I found it. But then there is a time to count it as lost, where you just say, it's lost. I have no idea where it is. And you just, in your mind, you just let go of it and you release yourself from that burden. And again, that's a mental decision. You've got to have the confidence to be able to do that. You have to give yourself a pep talk and say, it's gone, it's done, God can provide, something like that. But there is a time to count it lost. Same with the last half of the verse, a time to keep and a time to throw away. For most United States citizens, the time to keep is easy. We're sort of all half hoarders. We all have a lot more than we need. We have more clothing than we need. We have more food in our pantry than we need, that kind of thing. But getting rid of stuff, at least I'm speaking in my life, that's difficult. If I didn't have a wife, I'd have all these ratty old shirts. But eventually she basically goes in and sort of makes me throw out my old stuff. It's like, for Pete's sake, you haven't worn this in 3 years, get rid of it. It's ratty anyway, that kind of thing. But throwing away things can be difficult, but it's something the mature Christian needs to learn to do. Then verse 7, a time to tear. And in the biblical culture, what people tore was their robes. You might remember at the trial of Christ, when Christ talked about being the Son of God, Caiaphas, the high priest, tore his robe and said, what further need have we of witnesses? And there's various places in Scripture where people tore their robes. And then verse 7, this part is pretty cool because it says a time to sow. And what was that? You tore your robe in a time of grief, and you lived in that grief because verse 4 says there's a time to weep. And when that time of weeping is over and you're emotionally ready to handle it, you would sew your garment back up. And you're restoring yourself to wholeness. You're saying, okay, I'm in a mental position where I can put that behind me now. Contrast that to Jacob in Genesis when his sons came in and said, Joseph is dead. And it says Jacob in Genesis, it says Jacob tore his clothes and he said, I will go down to my grave mourning for my son. Meaning I'm never going to let this go. I'm never going to get over it. I'm never get to a point of sewing my garment back up. But this is buried in this. When it says a time to tear and a time to sow, there's a time to get over the mental anguish you're going through. It's not that it's going to be gone totally, but there's a time to begin to move on with your life. You have to recognize that, and there's a time to sow and say, I'm moving on with my life. Interestingly enough, I recently talked to a lady whose husband had passed away. Well, I take that back. I recently talked to a lady whose husband had passed away, but her husband had passed away a number of years ago, but it took her a number of years to get over it. And she said, I've had his picture on my wall for all these years, and I walked by it recently and said, I don't know you anymore. I've aged, I've matured, I've changed. The person you were married to isn't me anymore. And she just said, there was something inside me that very day, when I looked at that picture, there was something inside me that shifted that very day. And I said, I'm ready to move on. And she knew it. She knew it within herself. That's the time to sow and put your life back together. Then a time to be silent and a time to speak. That's really important. And I think we all know that. There's a time when the mature person is silent, and there's a time when the mature person knows to speak up and not let their voice be unheard. And then verse 8, a time to love and a time to hate. And that's the time to hate part is important for us to grasp and digest, because even God in the Bible says, these things I hate, and that type of thing. Now, the word hate can mean love less, it can mean ignore, but just having permission to realize there are some things we don't want to aggressively hate in the sense that we're not forgiving and we're not wishing the best on somebody, but we hate them in the sense that we don't have to have any dealings with them, that kind of thing. And there's good commentary on hate. And then a time for war and a time for peace. And I love that because there are people who say there's never a time for war. But Exodus chapter 15, the Bible says God is a man of war. Where exactly is that? That's Exodus chapter 15. Verse 3. That the Bible says that Yahweh is a man of war. And then we know that he is. He commanded that the Israelites fight some wars. He helped the Israelites win some wars. In the book of Revelation, chapter 19, Jesus Christ will come and fight the battle of Armageddon. And in Revelation chapter 20, God will rain fire down upon his enemies and finally kill or consign to the lake of fire, I guess, the adversary and his demons and that kind of thing. So there is a time for love. There is a time to love people less. And there is a time for war where we've got to make war on evil. And there's a time for peace. So as we read this and really understand it and put the pieces together, and it's the kind of thing that it's like you almost have to read a half a verse a day. If you read them all together, like I just taught them, they all kind of blend in and they're kind of a mush. And it's like, whoa, and it went by. And it's like, wow, what did he say? And I know that because I've done it for years. And then all of a sudden you just pick a day and I'm just going to say, I'm going to read one phrase of that and just meditate on it and think about it and what it means to me. And again, part of the great healing I've seen in this is the release from guilt, the guilt for moving on with something, the guilt for throwing something away, the guilt for taking time to heal, the guilt for taking time to weep, the guilt for having intermixed laughter with your mourning, that kind of thing. And this understanding this and meditating on it can bring us a lot closer to God, a lot more emotionally whole and spiritually mature. So thanks for being with me tonight. It's been a blessing to teach this. I hope it's been a blessing to you.